cost of living crisis is a term that is associated with Europe these days more than other parts of the world. The country that is in the lead in Europe is the UK. A series of labor strikes and industrial disputes have occurred in various industries of the UK's economy as workers have walked out over pay and conditions, the most recent one being junior doctors and consultants. In this edition of The Spotlight, we will look at why so many workers in so many different sectors of the UK are striking and whether the Sunak government has been able to handle the issue properly. First, let me introduce our guest for this program. Keith Pilbeam, Professor of International Economics and Finance at City University, joins us from London. Tony Gosling, historian and investigative journalist, joins us from Bristol. Welcome to you both. Keith Pilbeam, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts on this strike by doctors and consultants? It's a 3-day walkout, but it is said that it's going to affect, obviously, the care that patients are going to need. And that's another whole question that I'm going to ask on that regard. But do they stand a chance? It sounds like the government has to come to the negotiating table, but are they going to do that?
Well, the government, let's be honest, is out of money. They wasted so much money during the COVID pandemic, etc. Yeah, PPE equipment. They don't have much money left. We still got a massive fiscal deficit in this country, all right? And therefore, there really isn't the money to make big pay rises in the public sector. So at the end of the day, the government must also realise that these strikes are extremely costly, because they're leading to people not getting their medical care on time. That means they're off work, not paying taxes, etc. So at the end of the day, there has to be some sort of compromise. It's going to be nowhere near the 35% catch-up the doctors would like. That's never going to happen, because it would just spark off further pressures in the public sector. But an inflation matching pay rise is certainly something the government can afford. And we've got to remember that a lot of these people, you know, particularly consultants, they're getting taxed at 62% for quite a bit of their income, between £100,000 and £125,000.
I'm sorry,
There's
how much did you say?
62%.
62%.
62%. Yeah, because they lose their tax-free allowance, which is also taxed at 40%. So if you earn an extra 25,000 between 100 and 125,000, which a lot of consultants are in, 15,500 goes to the government and 9,500 goes to them. So not many people know about this, but this is clearly another thing that is, you know, really, I mean, the government wants to cut taxes for the wealthy, but won't cut it for the middle classes, who are being taxed outrageously at 62% for a certain amount of their income. It goes down afterwards. After 125,000, it drops down to 47%. Which is still pretty high, but it's 62%. And that actually gets a lot of doctors, you see. So Liz Truss, when she did these tax cuts for the very wealthy, okay, above 160,000, which, you know, that seems rather stupid when she could have actually done something for these doctors that are between the 100 to 125,000, all right? So that's stupidity of the first order. And it's a stupid tax anyway. It's actually holding the economy back because lots of doctors stop working when they've got £99,900, okay? No one wants to be taxed at 62%. I'm not making these figures up. They're facts. You can go to the HMRC website and check them out. So
I'm sorry to jump in, but I just checked out what you said in terms of taxes, and I put an average worker, and I'm shocked to find out that it says the UK's take-home pay of an average single worker after tax and benefits was 76.4% of their gross wage, compared to the OECD average of 75.4%.
Yeah.
How does that? This changes the whole tone of the program. How do you figure the government? What comes to mind is if they're taking that much taxes away, it must leave the government more room to negotiate. But then they probably are banking on these taxes in terms of revenues that they're spending in other places, I'm guessing.
Well, you see, you also, when you earn your money, they take off income, national insurance off you and everything like that. But then, of course, they're taking VAT when you're in your spending money. So you're paying even more when you fill up your car with petrol. Right. You know, you put £100 in, £75 is probably off to the government.
Let me bring in.
So it's shocking rates of taxation we're facing. And basically, the government can't raise taxes anymore. That's clear.
Right. Let's bring in Tony Gosling in here.
Good on the wealthy.
Let's bring in Tony
Okay.
Gosling in here. Tony Gosling, I'm sorry to take so long to get to you, but this is just shocking stats on the tax issue where, aside from the government putting that aside, how do people survive if that much taxes are taking out? Because that's something that was overlooked and not really spoken much about when it comes to the workers and the pay they're getting in terms of how much taxes that's being taken out.
It's built into the system. As there is inflation, as is now running food inflation nearly 20%, it's just coming down a little bit, but that's where it's been. So everybody is moved up into the higher tax brackets. And what they've been doing is they've not been moving the tax brackets. So people at the moment, on average wages, are being taxed like maybe a decade ago the super rich were. So these rates of tax, and it's the same with housing, exactly the same with housing. So, you know, say, for example, the inheritance tax thresholds haven't been raised, even though the price of housing is going up. So as the economy starts to fall apart, more and more middle earners and low wage earners are moving up into the high tax rates. And actually what's happening is work is no longer a way out of poverty. So people are starting to work and then finding that they're actually ending up with less money than they've had on benefits, and they simply cannot pay the rent, and they're being evicted from their homes, this sort of thing. So you're right. Welcome to basket case Britain, because the economy is in an absolutely terrible state. In a way, it's a kind of hybrid war, the same hybrid war that's being waged on Ukraine. And of course, if you think about, but it's being waged on the British people as well. And if you think about the amounts of billions that have been spent on Ukraine, it's quite obvious the government does have the money to pay the doctors. They have a choice to make. Do they want that money to go to arms and to arming this proxy war we're doing for the Americans over in far distant Eastern Europe? Or do they want to pay doctors properly? And the fact of the strikes, I'm absolutely 100% with the doctors, because the doctors know that what's happening is the senior staff in the health service, particularly the professionals that are making the life and death decisions, the consultants, the doctors, the registrars, are moving abroad because the pay is too low here. They cannot afford to pay the rent, to pay the mortgage on those wages. And so they're going off to get much better wages abroad. And so they are the ones who are trying to save the health service by flagging up to the nation that they need to be paid proper wages in order to keep the NHS alive. And of course, if you think about the government we've got at the moment, the Conservatives have always wanted to destroy the National Health Service, this free health service for everyone in the country. The Conservatives don't like that. They want to go over to a American-style health insurance system. And actually, the American health companies are they've got very busy London offices because they are lobbying for this change too. So they're trying to destroy the National Health Service, and they're doing that by making sure the doctors just leave the country, flee the country and go abroad.
Well, let's move on beyond just the health service and take a look at other sectors of the UK economy if we can, because this thing about taxes has thrown me off. But Keith Pilbeam, nevertheless, I'd like to ask you about one of the things that are in the basket of expenses of an average person there in the UK and across the world, really, in a matter of speaking, and that's the cost of food. We know food prices have risen, but by how much have they risen? I'm trying to get an idea based on going through the inflation, which puts it at around 7 or 8%. But I think it's a lot more than that, because when you look at categories of food or just food itself, whether it's margarine or eggs or other items, you can see that it's a lot more than that. It depends what you're looking at. It doesn't really come out to the 7 or 8% they're talking about. What's the story there?
Well, food inflation is much higher than 7 or 8%. It is actually around 17%. Of course, it depends. For different people, it'd be higher or lower, depending what food they eat. But food inflation has been running particularly high, which impacts the poorest people. You see, the headline rate of inflation, 6.8 now, but don't forget it was 10.9. That doesn't mean everything went up by 10.9 or 6.8%, all right? Some things go up far more. And of course, poor people spend proportionately more of their money on food. So the inflation rate facing poor people is substantially higher than the headline figure. Everybody knows that, the government knows that, and no one can deny it. So that is causing poor people problems because, you know, they spend more of their money on food and rent, of course, which has also been skyrocketing. So the Bank of England, I believe, is trying to do some analysis of this, but, you know, if you're in the lower 20%,
right.
of British income, you're getting, inflation plus tax rises, and council tax going through the roof.
Sure.
It's miserable.
It is. Well, Tony Gosling, when I read this headline, I thought I felt a sigh of relief for the people there in the UK, where the Guardian, I'm going to say the name, ran and said UK food prices fall in September for the first time in 2 years. But then you read the print below that, taking a closer look, it dropped by 0.1%. If we're looking at 19.4% or 19.1%, and they cited that as being food inflation for 2022, that's not much of a price drop, if you ask me. I mean, it doesn't sound like a lot at all compared to the rate of food inflation. What's the impact that it has had on poverty there in the UK?
Well, let me just explain. It's not really a price drop at all. What's been happening is these German-owned supermarkets, Lidl and Aldi, have been opening across the country. They've been doing very well and opening new stores over the last couple of years. And so what we're seeing is more and more people leaving the mainstream British supermarkets and going to these German cheapo supermarkets. And so therefore that's the only thing that's really been bringing. The fact of the matter is that these massive food cartels have been price fixing. They know they've got pretty much a stranglehold on the market, that the small grocer shops dotted around the country, there's not many left, are really not able to compete with these massive supermarkets anymore. And so they do deals with the supermarkets as a cartel, and they've been slowly putting up the prices. In fact, there have been one or two supermarkets, such as Sainsbury's here in Britain, who have actually refused to stock products like Heinz products, for example, because these massive food conglomerates have been price fixing, and they're saying, well, this is far too much. We want to sell someone else's baked beans or whatever, and we're not going to sell yours because your price is way too high. Your margins are high. And of course, this is just being done to the benefit of shareholders, because they now have such a stranglehold on the food market that they can start to jack up prices anywhere they want. And I mean, this is, of course, as Keith says, it's affecting the poor far more. And that's the perversity of all of this, is that you've now got the rich paying virtually no tax. These are the people, by the way, if we wanted to raise tax, we've got lots of super rich people that we could be taking this money off from their investments. Say, for example, you've got hundreds of millions of pounds invested. Well, if you were to lose half of that, you wouldn't even notice a single difference in your lifestyle. And so that we should be morally doing. We should be grabbing that money, even if it is offshore, or if as soon as we should, we need to take the money off the rich. And what's happening is, with this food price inflation, is the poor are being hit and the rich are being left scot-free. So it's almost certain. I mean, we've had the big speech today by British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak at the Conservative Party conference. They've got a general election next year, so it's probably his last chance to sell the Conservative vote to the voters. And he's come up with absolutely nothing at all. And he's talking about change, but we know that he's not changing anything. So it seems to me, and in fact I've heard this from insiders, that there are many people at the top of the Conservative Party here that don't want to win the next general election. So they're not interested in dealing with these issues. They're only interested in looking at their apps on their phones to see how much dividends on their big share investments that they're getting. That's their interest. The public and the voters are nowhere in the equation.
We're going to talk about that a little bit more, but I'd like to ask you an economic question here, Keith Pilbeam, because it seems like it's a contradiction, but yet it works out for the benefit of the economy somehow, which is why I want to ask you, and that's the deal with interest rates. All right, we know that there's interest rates that have been risen on a number of occasions by the central bank, and that is the way to tame inflation, for lack of a better word. But when you raise the interest rates, it's got its pluses and minuses. Can you please explain to us how that works out? Because we know that there are obviously setbacks based on the impact it has on the different sectors of the economy.
Well, interest rates, of course, they've gone up. But what one must remember is that they were manipulated by the Bank of England to record levels for numerous years, barely below 1%. All right, so even on 10 years, the government could borrow, at 0.6%, with inflation target of 2%. That made no economic sense whatsoever, by the way. You know, and all these people that invested in those bonds, including pension funds, by the way, that was stupidity of the highest order. I mean, no one should be lending to governments at 0.6% with an inflation target of 2%. All right. So now they can't print any more money. They've printed so much that it's actually one of the big causes of inflation. They won't admit it. Andrew Fairley, I insist on calling him Fairley, not Bailey. You know, he printed so much money, it's just incredible. 300 billion in 1 year to pay for all this COVID and fiscal deficits. So eventually, you see, that's going to come home to roost. And interest rates are bound to go up when inflation goes up. And now inflation is up and not really under control because people are still trying to catch up because they lost out last year on their wage rises, you know, less than inflation. So they're trying to catch up this year. It's not going to go down quickly. The Bank of England was, as usual, asleep at the wheel. They said inflation would go to 4.5, you know, well outside their target, by the way. Then it went to 6, then they were forecasting 8, then they forecasted 10. I mean, the Bank of England should be closed as an institution, you know, with its forecasting record, and the governor's sacked. So we've got to get used to much higher interest rates, all right? Because we've now got record levels of debt. The government has borrowed so much money that the national debt has gone from, you know, to over 100% of GDP. Companies have borrowed too much, all right? When interest rates were low, what do people do? They borrow, borrow, borrow. And of course, people borrow to buy houses at absurd prices. And when interest rates go up, it's bound to hit the property sector and many other sectors. Zombie companies, they've been kept alive through low interest rates, okay? But now interest rates are going up. Those zombie companies have to liquidate, go bankrupt. And we're seeing that increasingly, bankruptcies everywhere. And it was all because of the incompetence of the Bank of England. They should not be celebrating getting inflation down to 6.8 or 5. It is ridiculously high. It is still well above the maximum of 3%. It's 2% plus or minus 1%.
Okay.
So this is not any success. This is failure. You can't celebrate failure of that degree and say you're doing something.
All right, Tony Gosling, you talked about Sunak. One of the things that has come out, and I'd like to ask from you, whether it's a reflection of the types of decisions that go against maybe improving the economy, and that was the cancellation, from what we understand, of the scrapping of the HS2, which was said that it would have cut journey times, would have created more space on the rail network, and also would boost jobs outside of London. What are your thoughts, first of all, on his decision on doing that? And tell us some of the flops that he has actually is guilty of when it comes to the economy, the decisions that he made that has impacted the economy negatively.
Well, look, these massive infrastructure projects like HS2 should never have been signed off in the first place. That money could far better have been spent on upgrading existing railways, opening maybe some of the railways which were shut in the 1960s, and that sort of thing would have been extremely good for the environment. But no, most of the pressure to sign those contracts to build this railway were there from the construction companies, because they've made an absolute fortune on this railway to nowhere. It is just from London to Birmingham, which is, there is an existing fairly good service there anyway, which they could have used maybe 1/10 of this money to upgrade that service. The whole thing is, I think, a contract fraud that was signed by the Labour at the end of the last Labour government in 2009, and then the Conservatives, if they had had a proper look at the books, should have just scrapped it as soon as they came into office in 2010. But they don't like that. It's embarrassing, and there may be costs. They actually had Jacob Rees-Mogg quite bravely said that the whole thing should have been scrapped 5 years ago. He said that. So you know, this is a disaster. It's good that it's gone. The other thing is, the other infrastructure project near me in Bristol is this Hinkley C nuclear power station. Again, there's no real guarantees this is going to deliver affordable electricity ever, and yet billions are being spent on these projects. I think it's just really about the construction contracts. Those companies are going to definitely get lots and lots of money, but there may be nothing at the end of it to deliver. So this is, I think, a massive fraud, enormous mistakes he's made, Sunak, and of course the chances are he's never going to make it to win an election next year. No chance. It's most probably going to be a hung parliament, because the reason is because this has not been an economic crisis for everybody. The super rich 0.1% have done incredibly well out of this Conservative government, and they have actually seen their billions multiply. And those are the people who are calling the shots. And that's why it's almost impossible that Sunak, because he came out with something today about smoking, for example, which you think, well, this is not going to win you the election, mate. No chance. And so he's got nothing to offer, really, except empty words. And so we're probably going to see a Labour government next year, and the Conservatives are going to applaud their leader as he just drags them down into a black hole, never to be seen again.
All right, I got one last question over here. I was going to talk about how the rich got richer, but that almost sounds like a cliche. So, Keith Pilbeam, my last question is about manufacturing in the UK, where it is said that there's been it's been on the decline, to the point where many headlines read why the government has actually abandoned the manufacturing sector. Is it that bad? Has manufacturing declined to the point that the UK doesn't really make anything anymore? In a minute, if you can, please.
Well, we've still got the manufacturing base, but it's been decimated by Brexit. And you see that in the car industry. You know, output is now half what it was in 2016. No one wants to invest here. You get the odd thing that comes up because the government's subsidising it. Yep. Second the subsidies run out, they'll be either asking for more money or closing these factories. So it's been in decline for many years. This government doesn't care about manufacturing. We do have some good manufacturers, by the way. But the death now has been paperwork, bureaucracy and Brexit. Their closest market is, of course, now very difficult for them, especially small manufacturers. You know, they used to use the EU to grow a bit bigger. Now they don't grow bigger, they stay in the UK. And also they can't get the parts so easily from Europe because they don't want to supply them because of the paperwork again. So it's all self-inflicted. It's, you know, the whole country's gone to pot, really. And it's incompetence of the government. It's not just Brexit. It is the most incompetent government we've probably ever had in the last 10 years. I can't think of any government over the last 10 years, including, you know, that includes Boris, of course. But this shambles is just 13 years of disaster.
Yeah,
okay, but 30 seconds. 30 seconds, Tony Gosling.
Okay, well, look, the trouble is that Britain lost control of its industrial policy, not because of Brexit, but when they entered the EEC back in the 1970s. Britain's governments have never had control of their economic policy. At least we still got the pound, which gives us a little bit of leeway. And ultimately, I'm afraid Britain is not going to be, and it's not just Britain, it's the whole of Europe. Germany is now slumping its manufacturing base, so Britain can shake hands with the Germans and say we're going to go down together.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you. Tony Gosling, their historian and investigative journalist, and thank you, Keith Pilbeam, Professor of International Economics and Finance at City University. Thank you to you both. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From me, Kavitahwe and the team, it's goodbye.